Hi David, I'm Joan Gremont and Lynette Reclusen is here on the camera. It is Saturday, October 31st, 2015, and finally we've managed to get this interview going, so we're very happy about that.
Very cool.
David, tell us about what you know, when and why your family originally immigrated to South Africa, and what can you share about their lives in South Africa in the early years?
Let's start with my dad's family. They came from Riga, I think, in Latvia. Both my dad's parents emigrated to South Africa. My dad actually was born in Vereeniging. Lived his whole life there. Went to Jeppe Boys High School in Johannesburg. And actually, I think his mom and dad were actually born in Vereeniging, if I think about it.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I think it was his parents that actually were born in Riga. My mom's grandparents or parents, her dad was born in Neustadt in Lithuania in 1844. His name was Savvy Marks. He left Neustadt at a very young age, went to live in Sheffield in England, met his future wife in Sheffield, Bertha Gutmann, by the Gutmann family.
So was she English or where was she?
She was actually English.
Okay.
They were in the knife. He learned the knife business in Sheffield, how to make and sharpen knives. When the South African diamond mines and gold mines were starting to open up, Sammy actually went down to South Africa and did not take his wife with him at that time. He went to establish himself down in Cape Town, where he spent most of his time initially as a spouse.
Yeah.
So he had a wagon in which he sold schmutter and pots and pans and stuff. So that's really how he started.
Do you know what year that was? Do you have an approximate date?
He went down in, I think, 1868, 1869.
Okay.
It's a long time ago. Once he'd gotten established, he actually went back to Sheffield, got his wife, and they moved down to Cape Town and then eventually up to the Transvaal in South Africa. He was an interesting guy in the sense that he started with nothing, was not able to read and write, did not have a formal education, was a very good businessman, recognized that the country was expanding, bought up a lot of farmland where there were big coal deposits and so on. Eventually moved to Pretoria, where he had an opportunity to buy two farms 12 miles east of Pretoria. The first one was the farm called Swartkoppies, and the second one was a farm right next door called Pino's Poort. A total about 5,000 morgen in those days. The story behind why he was given the right to buy the farms was, we can go into lots of detail, but basically he, even though he was Jewish and did celebrate the holidays, but did not celebrate Friday nights or Shabbat, interestingly enough, although he was a very religious man. He used to mediate between the Boers and the British during the Boer War. And so he knew, he actually knew Cecil John Rhodes personally. He knew Paul Kruger personally. He mediated between the British and the Boers and had both those guys, gentlemen at Swartkoppies, the farm that he built, during that period to see if they could come to some kind of a settlement between them. Because of the work he did in that regard and was perceived as being an intermediary but also a neutral party, Paul Kruger said, "Sammy, I want to give you something for your efforts." And he said, "I'm going to close the mint in Pretoria for a day and I'm going to mint you 100 gold tickies. And that was the origin of the 100 gold tickies, that they talk about the Kruger tickies, which are worth a lot of money today, but we're not sure where all of them are. I know some cousins who have a lot of them, actually. So it was a great honor to him, and he was given those tickies. So he was a great ambassador for South Africa, became a senator in the government in South Africa, and eventually died in 1820. So he was 1844. I guess he was a good
1920, I think you mean.
1920.
Yes.
Sorry. So he was what?
Short of 80.
80, yeah, 76 years old. He had 4 sons and 2 daughters, all of which were educated in England at various English private schools, boarding schools, one of which was my grandfather, Joe, who actually continued to farm the farm Schwartkopies and Pienaarspruit through his whole life until his death. My mom, Jill Katzen, was his only child. He was married to Cecilia Bowes-Lyon. Now, Sippy, as they used to call her, I think was from like Kroonstad or Welkom or one of those towns. A very interesting lady. Her first husband had been and this was my grandmother, her first husband had been a fellow called John French, who was an Irish Catholic from Ireland, who was a wild game hunter in Angola. So she lived in Angola for a while. My mom's half-sister is actually born in the bush in Angola before they moved back down to South Africa. At which time Sippy, my mother's mother, actually met my grandfather, Joe, who was her second husband. So my mom had a brother and a sister from her mom's first marriage to John French. Then she was the only child from her mom's second marriage. And they were married many, many years. My mother's mother was quite a character, actually, and there's a lot of very fascinating history with her. She was a great gambler, loved to gamble, actually went through 3 husbands' fortunes during her lifetime, including my grandfather. Okay. There's a story about her. She was living in England. She loved to live in England. And she had gone to Monte Carlo for the weekend and had run up a bill or a losses gambling with chemin de fer at the casino there of about £10,000. Well, back in the 1940s, that was a lot of money. And the story is that she had known Aristotle Onassis at that time. And he had walked up to the casino manager and said, "Don't worry about Mrs. Bowes-Lyon's losses. I'll take care of them." And he did, apparently. So that's the story, and I don't know whether... So she was a very colorful personality who was married to my mother's dad, Joe, who was a farmer, and really, in all senses of that word. He used to farm beef and pigs, and a nice Jewish boy farming pigs, and a lot of fruit trees, pears, peaches, and all that kind of stuff. My mom's third husband actually was Ronnie Bowes-Lyon, who, interestingly enough, was actually a first cousin to the Queen Mom in England. He was part of the Bowes-Lyon family, Captain Ronald Bowes-Lyon.
Wait, you said your mother's first husband.
Third husband.
Third husband.
Third husband was Captain Ronnie
Right.
Bowes-Lyon.
You mean your grandmother's?
My grandmother's.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
So, and my mom was very friendly with him, and so on. Throughout her whole life, she maintained a relationship with all her husbands who loved her dearly, but just couldn't stay married to her for whatever reason. So when my mom was born, she was actually born in the central Pretoria, in the Paul Kruger house. There's a museum there of Paul Kruger's house. She was actually born in that house when she was born in 1927.
Yeah.
And the Paul Kruger, there's a statue in the central Pretoria, right? That was donated to Pretoria by Sammy Marks. So that statue of Paul Kruger in the center of the city, and all the busts around it, had been contributed to the city by my great-grandfather. So a lot of history with that side of the family, with Pretoria itself. As I said, my dad came from Vereeniging, and Sammy Marks actually had huge investments in Vereeniging because he was an industrialist, and he had actually met my mom in Vereeniging right after the Second World War, after my dad got back from he was up in North Africa for 6 years. And in those days, they didn't just travel back to Johannesburg when they had leave. There was no way to get back. So when he went to North Africa and then up into the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, he couldn't get back. So his parents passed away while he was in North Africa. He never came back. He came back at the age of 31 without a college education. My mom actually met him in a cinema, in a movie theater in Vereeniging. And even though he was 11 years older than her, they got married back in 1944, was when they eventually got married. Interesting thing about going back to Sammy Marks and that side of the family, he was a very interesting guy. He established the first major brick factory in South Africa called Eerste Fabrieken. And because he owned that, he actually, I don't know if it was a desire, but there was a necessity to build the Walmerand Street Shul in downtown Johannesburg. He actually donated the bricks, the red bricks, to the shul to build the shul from the Eerste Fabrieken, the first brick factory that he had established in Pretoria. So lots of interesting...
Well, you're being very modest about your great-grandfather, because you don't talk about the Sammy Marks Museum. Have you been there?
I have. And in fact...
So which of the farms is that on?
That's on Swartkopies.
Right.
And it's interesting because that house was built in stages over a period of time. My grandfather lived there all his life. I used to spend every weekend there with my grandfather, and so did all my kids. And I have many friends who I grew up with. I was at elementary school and in high school with, who spent many weekends with me at the farm. So I know the farmhouse very, very well. I used to play all over it. Eventually, they wanted to make it into a museum because there's a lot of interesting history associated with it, a lot of interesting people visiting it, a lot of interesting furniture in it.
And all the original furniture and everything is in there.
It is.
Yes.
And so, about 15 years ago, my mom and some cousins of ours who were administrators of the Sammy Marks estate, somebody had approached them about converting it to a museum. The family all thought it was a great idea, especially because he was Jewish and he had such an impact, at least in the early days, on South Africa. So the family did, they sold it to the museum at a very good price and then donated all the furniture and everything for a nominal amount to establish the museum at Swartkopies. So they actually have a book here, which I can show you later, which was written by this fella, Alan Prost, of all the great houses in South Africa, and actually Swartkopies is in the book. And it shows you pictures of the billiard room, of the snooker room, where I can tell you I whiled away many hours as a young boy in that house. Yeah.
But even the photographs on the wall of Paul Kruger and the other, famous South Africans.
There are.
And I have to tell you that I remember seeing the Kiddush Cup there. So you said he didn't celebrate Shabbat. The Kiddush Cup, the original Kiddush Cup is there.
There's not a lot that if you walk into the house that would say this man was a Jew, but there are pieces around the house that you clearly can see that he was Jewish, and menorahs and candlesticks and things like that they used there. And he was a very devout man, actually, a very religious man himself. So.
But what you're not mentioning, and I understand you're being modest, is at any time you mention South African Jews, Sammy Marks' name comes up first as being the most influential and important Jew in South Africa.
Yes, and I think he was at that time, of course.
Yeah.
He had a tremendous impact on establishing the gold fields, the diamond mines in Kimberley,
Yeah.
brick factories, and actually at one time he and his cousin Isaac Lewis, who he brought out to South Africa, owned between them over 3 million acres of farmland and so on between them, which the family doesn't have anymore, I might add. Wish we did. Yeah.
So, David, tell us more about your own life. You grew up where? Were you in Johannesburg?
I grew up in Johannesburg. I have 3 sisters, Linda, Frances, and Tessa. My mom is Jill. She was the only child, as I mentioned. My father's name is Astley. He was one of 4. He had 3 sisters. He was the youngest. He was the boy. I always lived in Joburg, although my parents lived in Vereeniging for a lot of their lives. My 2 elder sisters actually lived in Vereeniging in their early years before that my parents moved to Johannesburg. And my dad really was an entrepreneur. He owned a bottle store in Vereeniging called Katzen's Bottle Store. He owned a couple of men's warehouses around. He owned a hardware store near Wits University called Braamfontein Hardware. It was on the corner there. So he was kind of an entrepreneur. Eventually, he and my mother's father, Joe, built the Rosebank Clinic, the hospital down in Rosebank. They developed that and built that, and nearly went Magula with it, but eventually it came right, and then they eventually sold it. So I grew up in Joburg. Was born, I think, at the Marymount. Is there a Marymount?
Right.
Yeah. One of 4 kids, only boy. Went to Pridwin Elementary School, a nice Anglican school for a nice Jewish boy. And then went to St. Stithians College in Randburg, a good Methodist school for a nice Jewish boy. So I'm probably one of the few Jewish guys living in Dallas who didn't go to King David. But it had a great education. My sisters all went to Kingsmead in Rosebank.
Right.
So a little bit of an unusual background in the sense that I think my grandmother on my mother's side had been married to a lot of non-Jewish men during her life, or 2 non-Jewish men during her life. And so to my parents that wasn't important.
Right.
But nevertheless, in spite of that, I had a cousin who insisted I go to shul with him every Friday night and every Saturday morning. And in spite of my dad, who I was very close to, I did have a bar mitzvah at Volman Street shul.
Right.
Which incidentally, of course, in those days was one of the primary shuls with Oxford Shul in Johannesburg. So at the age of 18 or 17, I guess I was at the time, I graduated matric, or I matriculated at St. Stithians, went into the army, in South African Army, into the artillery, spent a year in Potchefstroom,
Right.
with the Vierde Veldbatterij. Actually, Alan Pizer was in the army with me, and of course he lives in Dallas, Texas now as well.
Right.
So, yeah, and Kenny Davis was with me. He's in New York, I think now. So had a good year there, and then after that went to Wits for 3 years, did a BCom. It was a joint BCom LLB kind of a finance degree, and then after that, like a lot of the South Africans, we were concerned about the political future, and that's when my mom and dad, particularly my mom actually, who had been schooled in England and actually was living in London during the Blitz with her mom, had been evacuated back to South Africa when the German bombers came over London. She decided that it would be a good idea for the family to consider moving. So we had a lot of English family at that time. Her sister was in London, a lot of cousins were in London. We moved to live in England.
Okay.
And up until that point, I'd been dating my wife Georgie, who I'd met when I was 13. The lovely Georgie, of course. And we kind of broke up, but then I went to live in London, and I asked her to come to London. And shortly thereafter, about 3 years after she came, we got married in England, on Abbey Road, in a little shul called the New London Synagogue. It was about 100 yards from the famous Beatles Crossing in London, so I always remember that, and it was kind of nice. It was a lovely day in July in London. And then we lived in London for 9 years, from 1977 to 1984, at which time I had been chatting with an attorney here in Dallas, Ron Gasworth, who is very known a lot by the South African community, and Ron had done all my labor certification. The reason we came to Dallas, of course, was because Georgie's sister Andy and her brother-in-law Norman Gordon had moved to Dallas in 1976. So they were kind of one of the first South African groups to come to Dallas. I had been working in London as a chartered accountant. I had qualified in London as a chartered accountant. So it was a hard move for us to make that move, especially because I was leaving family.
Yes, I was going to ask, how did your parents feel about you leaving London?
They were not happy, particularly because my eldest son Jamie had been born, and that was their first grandchild. So, but they understood the desire for me to come and live in the United States, because I really kind of felt my personality fit better with the open American style way of doing things than the English way. Although I'm very comfortable in England, and we go back often to see my family who still live there. So Georgie and I moved to Dallas in '84, and at that time I had one son, Jamie, who was 18 months old. I joined Arthur Young, which was the predecessor to Ernst & Young, big accounting firm, and did well with the firm, got my labor certification, then a green card, and went through, originally transferred actually across on an L1 visa, which was an intercompany transfer, and then applied for my green card, got that, and then of course applied for citizenship. So we hold both actually American and British citizenship, which I like to do, and interestingly enough, I insisted my boys do the same. So all my kids actually hold dual nationality, even though, well, Jamie, of course, is entitled to British citizenship, but the two youngsters were born, Michael and Stephen, were both born here in Dallas, but they hold dual nationality, as well as do Georgie and I. And so we've been in Dallas for the last 33 years, I guess. Love it here. I would not move back. My parents loved coming to visit us. My mom still loves coming to visit us. It's been actually a very, very positive move for us. I'm very, very happy that the family made the move out of South Africa. I think it's been very beneficial when I hear what's been going on back there.
So what year did your parents leave South Africa?
End of 1976.
All right, so this was just after the Soweto riots.
So just after the Soweto riots, correct.
Right. And David, tell us about your feelings and first impressions of the United States. Had you been to Dallas to visit before you moved here? I presume you had, to visit Andy and Norman? Yes,
we had. And George and I had toured in the United States. We'd been around. Dallas in those days reminded me a little bit of Vereeniging, and to be quite candid, it wasn't the city it is today. It's really changed a lot and continues to change a lot. So, but I was happy. I had a great job with a great company, and we traveled around a lot. We weren't restricted to Dallas at the time. I think Georgie had the most trouble. Because she'd been working in the West End of London for a travel company that specialized in doing tours to China in those days, which was unusual. And so I think Georgie had more of a culture shock than I did, because she wasn't working at that time, and was kind of bringing up a young kid. But over a period of time, I think we've both been very happy here, and I think adapted well to the culture.
Let's talk about your involvement in the Dallas Jewish community. Did you join a congregation when you got here?
We joined, yes, we joined Sheriff, Israel.
Right. And did your kids go to Jewish schools?
They started at Jewish schools.
Okay.
My eldest Jamie went to Akiba for a couple of years to kindergarten. The other two went to Levine Academy, or Solomon Schechter in those days.
Right.
And then the two older boys, we put them in Green Hill when they got to that, they're at that age. My youngest son Michael went to the public school system.
Okay.
So we did not keep them in religious school all that time, although we as a family have been very active in the Jewish community. Well, not very active, but quite active, probably more so than a lot of the families. So I've always been very active at Sheriff. My brother-in-law Norman, of course, was very active at Sheriff. I've been on the board a number of times. I've just come off the board and come off sitting on the executive committee. My son Jamie is now on the board at Sheriff, and he's also on the executive committee now. So it's nice to see that mantle being handed down a little bit. And we've always supported the Jewish community when we can.
So what would your father think about that?
My father would be pleased.
Good. I'm joking.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't a religious man, but he was a good guy.
Okay.
You know, and he was proud of the fact he was Jewish. He just wasn't a big shul guy.
Okay.
So.
And tell us about traditions that you've maintained at home, the Jewish cultural traditions. You know, the lighting the candles, Shabbat, that kind of
Well,
thing.
we clearly do Shabbat.
Right.
We go to shul when we can. We always celebrate the holidays. So whether it's Hanukkah, whether it's Rosh Hashanah, whether it's Yom Kippur, we celebrate, you know, all the holidays. Not all the holidays, but all the main holidays, and continue to do that and make sure that the kids have always been involved in doing that. I think that's what instills a lot of the Yiddishkeit in your family as you go forward. Enough to say, and I'm really proud of this. My eldest son Jamie married a girl, Megan Rooney from Kansas, she was born in Seattle, a nice Irish Catholic girl. And before they got married, she McGuyed.
Okay.
And she loves being Jewish. And so when they got married, it was really nice. I mean, it's been a very good thing. And Jamie insisted on that before he would even consider that. So I'm proud of that fact, because in this time, it's hard to do that, actually.
That's true. And tell us about how important Israel was to you growing up in South Africa.
Very.
Okay.
We were very actively involved. I even remember the 6-Day War. My sister Frances, who's a few years older than I am, who lives in London, she, and I've got it somewhere, I just haven't found it, I'm going to find it. It's very interesting. She had put together a whole scrapbook from all the newspapers and magazines in South Africa of pictures and documents and editorials on that whole 6-Day War, of what was going on at that time. So from a very young age, in 1967, I was 12. You know, my interest started then with Israel, I guess, and the family's interest. So we've always had a very keen interest. George and I have been to Israel. I think we'd like to go back again, take the kids with us. They have never been to Israel, which is a shame. So I think we're very supportive, and I would say I would consider myself a Zionist.
And do you still have family in South Africa? Close family? Do you go back there to visit?
I do have family. We have some cousins in Johannesburg, Martin and Diana Smullen, and their kids, and my other cousin Stephen. I have cousins in Cape Town, the Lubners. I don't have any immediate family back in South Africa. I have just cousins who we talk to, who we're friendly with, who we know. But like so many of the South African families, I've got family all over the world now, including Australia, Toronto, Canada, England. My elder sister Linda lives in Italy. I've got family in Israel, I mean in London, of course. and of course all over the United States.
And is there anything you miss about South Africa? Any customs, food, anything?
I think the thing about South Africa I miss the most is it was a very unique group of people living in South Africa. And I think we've kind of duplicated, the South African community is kind of duplicated that here in Dallas, where the South Africans tend to hang out with the other South Africans. I think they feel very comfortable amongst each other. There's a certain honesty about them that I really like. There's that tremendous sense of humor, which of course I really like. There's that caring that I really like. And I think there's a certain entrepreneurialism about the South Africans that I don't see, and a certain pushiness that I don't see with a lot of other folks that I deal with. And of course I deal with a lot of business people in my profession. So I miss that community, if there's one thing I miss. And of course the food.
And the food, of course. David, is there anything you'd like to tell us that I haven't asked you about, or anything we haven't covered? Tell us, your children are where? Let's talk about your children.
My eldest, Jamie, is 32. He's married to Megan.
And they live...
They live in Dallas.
Okay.
Jamie was at Green Hill. Then he went to University of Kansas for his undergrad. He went to law school down at St. Mary's in San Antonio. He then went to work after law school. Did get a job. That was good. While he was working, actually, he went back to SMU and did his tax LLM, a Master of Laws in Taxation. And now Jamie's working for Trust and Estate, well, actually a law firm here which does a lot of trust and estate work, wills and estates, and international tax, called Wright Ginsburg and Brucelow. Doing very well and is very happy living in Dallas with his wife Megan. I have another son, Stephen, who is 29. Stephen was at Green Hill. He then went to Tulane University in New Orleans for his undergrad. Decided he wanted to go to medical school. Did not get into medical school his first year that he applied, which was a shock to him. But that's life. So he decided he would go and tour Europe for 8 months with a backpack, which is what he did. Came back, did get into medical school the second time. Went to Texas Tech Medical School in Lubbock. So he spent 2 years in Lubbock and 2 years in Amarillo. Did exceedingly well. Scored very high on the board exams. And actually is now, and then applied to go and do a residency in neurosurgery down at Memorial Hermann in Houston, which is where he is now. So I think he's crazy. It's a hard road, but he's now in his third year of residency, so he's getting there. So I got to hand it to him. He's done great. Michael, my youngest, was told that he was not a good candidate for Green Hill, as he was likely to be very disruptive in class, which is probably true actually. But so he went through the Plano public school system, ended up playing football on the Plano West senior high team. He was the only Jewish kid playing football. I mean, it was like, whoa. Interesting. Did very, very well with the football. And he also got into Tulane University, which is a great school. His grades were good. He scored high on his tests. And he did a master's down at Tulane last year. And this year he's taken a job with a Canadian investment bank in New York called Canaccord Genuity. So Mikey's doing great. He's living the life of Riley. He loves New York. Enjoying the social aspects. He's, of course, working very hard. But he likes it. And he's 25. So at this point, Georgie and I are empty nesters. October 2015. Almost all the kids off the payroll.
Almost.
Just about.
David, tell us about the things that are next to you on the table.
Okay, so what I've got here is, this actually is a gold stopwatch, which actually has got my grandfather's initials on the back. And I think this, my mom gave this to me This actually was given to him by Sammy Marks as a present. And it's an antique watch. The chain, it's actually a fob watch, so they would wear it like this,
Right.
of course. The chain is gold, and it's just a beautiful watch which she gave to me as an inheritance. Just something to remember him by, and my great grandfather by. Yeah. I actually have these, which I thought would be of great interest. These are two, and unfortunately they've been ruined a little bit because they made them into cufflinks.
Right.
But I talked about the 100 gold tickies.
Right.
These are two of them.
Okay.
So they're valuable, but they're not as valuable. My mom actually has one of the original gold tickies in London, which she still keeps. And I think she's willed it to one of her grandchildren. But I've got these. My mom gave these to me, and of course these will go as an heirloom to one of my kids eventually. So this is when Paul Kruger closed the mint. These are two of the tickies that he made specifically for Sammy at that time. Interestingly enough, I don't know what they're worth actually, but they're worth a lot of money apparently.
What's interesting is they're called tickies, but they're much bigger
they
than
are.
what tickies really were.
Yeah. And actually it's interesting because the way these have been mounted, this is actually the head of Paul Kruger here.
Right.
Yeah. And this was like the South African flag. And I just thought this was interesting. I actually have a book. There's a book being written on Sammy Marks, and I can't find it. But I've got it somewhere in the house. Because there was a gentleman who, when they established the Jewish Museum in Cape Town, there's a whole section in that museum dedicated to Sammy Marks. And I've been there to see it. It was the guy who did that, I think, who wrote this book and researched it. It's actually fascinating. But this was a book, photographs by this fellow Alan Proust, if you can see that. And this is like the colonial houses of South Africa. And this actually, and I'll try and hold this up, if you can see it. This actually is the billiard room at Swartkopies that I used to spend hours and hours with one of my cousins playing snooker. And this is a scoreboard here. We used to score our actual games on this scoreboard, and we used to sit on these chairs smoking cigars like big shots when we were little kids. So, great history and great memories for me.
Look how spacious the rooms
Oh,
are. There's high ceilings.
Yeah, there's actually a shot of the part of the house as you.
Right.
Yeah. And this is actually a shot here where it's hard to see him. There's actually a shot of Sammy right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Let me see here. Yeah, these are the old style bathrooms.
So the house has been left as it was.
Yeah, I mean this is still like this.
Yeah.
I remember showering in these with the water coming at me from all angles. And in this bathroom was in the back of the house. This was a balcony up right outside the billiard room upstairs. The billiard room was upstairs. And when my mom was a kid, she used to suffer terribly from asthma. So she used to sleep out here. My grandpa put the bed out here for her to sleep. Yeah, so she used to sleep out there. It's a lovely house. I mean, this was the old kitchen with the whole big stove there. You can see it.
Old-fashioned stove.
Yeah.
Go back to that picture of Sammy.
Let me see
Show
if
that one again. Is there another one, a bigger one?
Well,
That family?
there is a picture here. I'll go back though. There's a picture here. I don't know if you can see this. Can you zoom in on that? It's very difficult. This is Sammy Marks here, and he's here with Lord and Lady Roberts, who was, I think, like the governor of South Africa in those days, with the British Army and all that stuff. Now, let me go back to that picture for you, and I'll show you.
There. Okay, great.
Yeah, he was a little man, apparently.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, a
Yeah, right.
Yeah, very,
But he
very
did
clever.
very well, so whatever he did, he did
Yeah,
well.
I mean, he did well, and you know, he left a great legacy, which is great. You know, there's a great legacy. It's just a shame that, you know, so much of the family has left South Africa, and there's no one to continue on, you know, farming the farm and taking advantage of all that. Interesting factoid. Sandy Marks had this opportunity to buy these two farms, Swartkopies and Pienaarspruit. And there was another farm on the other side, further away from Pretoria, on the way to like the, you know, the Eastern Transvaal, Nelspruit and so on. He bought the two farms that were the closest to Pretoria. They found the Cullinan diamond on the third farm, and a diamond mine, yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
So he picked the wrong two farms, actually.
Wow, that's amazing. Was that the
Yeah.
biggest diamond
Yeah,
ever found?
yeah, it's in the Crown Jewels,
Wow, interesting.
and that's where they found the Cullinan diamond, or whatever, however they say it. So he picked the wrong two farms,
But he did all right anyway.
yeah, he did fine. And so you know, he was a good guy. So that's really a little bit of history of my family. And obviously, we can talk for hours
Thank you. All right.
on everything. But thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
I
Thank you.
appreciate it very much.